Welcome everybody, especially to those of you who don't yet know Salzburg Global Seminar. We're absolutely delighted to come together, whether it's evening, morning, or the middle of the night in your time. I would like you to know that we have thick snow and sub-zero temperatures here in Salzburg, and it's even colder in Schloss Leopoldskron Library than it is outside. So please admire our courage as we come to you as the Designs on the Future team. Designs on the Future is about provocative questions that can tackle tough issues and exciting opportunities ahead. And it's directly inspired by Salzburg Global's own radical roots. We were founded out of conflict in 1947 by three young people at a moment of great historical and social pivot for the world. They had a bold vision of a Marshall Plan for the mind and set out to cut through prejudice and destroy the barriers of ignorance and hate. It certainly resonates today in 2020. So Salzburg Global has stood the test of time in our historic premises. We've had nearly 40,000 fellows come together through our work from nearly 180 countries. And right the way through, the work has been guided by our mission to challenge current and future leaders to shape a better world. We have focused on the building blocks for flourishing and inclusive societies around the rule of law, new technologies, upheavals during the Cold War, and civic engagement has been at the very heart of our work from the start, most recently with our landmark Academy on Media and Global Change, which has built a rising network, a rising young leaders global network. Back to this sense of history, we feel it very acutely today, one day after the inauguration of a new US president, and as the global COVID pandemic rages. Salzburg Global really embodies a shared duty and opportunity to write the history of the future together. So today, we are faced with converging crises, as we know too well, and that poses extraordinary challenges for leadership, for values, and for the systems that will stand the test of future decades. We're now turning to a highly provocative question. Can democracy catch up with technology? What better time to have this conversation? As I said, it's a day after a particularly historic presidential inauguration. It's 2 weeks after a sadly unforgettable moment of insurrection at the US White House. And it is 1 year exactly since the Kofi Annan Commission reported on elections and democracy in the digital age. It would be much too easy to narrow this global conversation to America's current stress test. But the key trends, risks, and domino effects around new technologies and their impact and opportunities for democracy are obviously global. Kofi Annan himself, the late Secretary General of the United Nations, was equally concerned and passionate about the role and opportunities for newer democracies. He was interested in creative responses across the global south to some of the challenges and the opportunities that these new technologies could enable. With that, it's an absolute pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker and our respondents. You can see the links to their bios in the chat box. Our main speaker is Professor Stephen Stedman. He was the Secretary General of the Kofi Annan Foundation Commission on Elections, Democracy and the Digital Age. And he's going to speak in conversation with me for 15-20 minutes, very relaxed. And then our first respondent will share some reflections. Antonella Mei-Pochtler has herself been on the front line this year, or last year, with a bird's eye view of how today's political leaders are grappling with these converging crises with COVID at the fore. She's the special advisor to Austria's Chancellor Kurz and the head of ThinkAustria. Once Stephen and Antonella have had a chance to debate together, we're then going to jump into live video debate. So right from the time that Professor Stedman starts talking, we invite you to put your questions into the chat box. Our team will do some filtering and send me some suggestions by WhatsApp. And if you're selected, you'll get a message in the chat box asking you to be ready to go live with your own question. I know we're scattered around the world, but what we're trying to do is forge a sense of closeness and community around these debates. So Professor Stedman, it's really great to be virtually in contact like this. And I'd like to focus in on the problem landscape that you've analysed and invite you to talk about the work that you led with the Commission and the recommendations that you've identified as we go along. As I said, it's a global conversation, although we recognize that the US has sucked a lot of oxygen out of attention to other elections and other democratic challenges around the world. We can see that a huge blame game is underway around social media and by implication technology as a key scapegoat for many of the ills we see around us. And yet you have held out by saying that polarization and partisanship long predate the arrival of social media. So could I start by asking you to talk about how you see this information ecosystem as it interfaces between democracy and technology?
I would love to, and thank you, Claire. And it's just wonderful to be doing stuff with the global seminar again. And looking at the library, I have fond memories from about 11 years ago when my family was there for a week, and my kids at the time were about 9 and 7, and played hide and seek in the library. So it's bringing back great memories. I'm going to start by saying Kofi Annan was incredibly prescient for creating the commission. And just to give some background, because it will put it into global perspective, this was the second Kofi Annan Commission that dealt with the integrity of elections. The first one I chaired back in 2010 to 2012. And Kofi's big concern then was what was happening in some countries in Africa, where, and this will sound familiar, where an incumbent loses an election, claims fraud, tries to get militias and the army and state forces behind him, and tries to extort power sharing or staying in power, right? So using violence to extort staying in power. That was 2010 to 2012. And he was thinking of places like Cote d'Ivoire. He was thinking of places like Kenya, Zimbabwe. And at the time, we had to come up with, how did we think about the integrity of elections? And at that time, we didn't deal with social media at all. It just wasn't on the horizon. And then, 8 years later, Kofi was saying, I am really worried. And so in 2018, he said, we need to really look hard at how social media affects the integrity of elections and the prospects for democracy. He was worried about disinformation, worried about hate speech. So we looked at this for about a year and a half. We issued our report back in January. We had a huge plan for rollout of the report, which then got overtaken by COVID, of course. But the conclusion that we came to was that there are some misconceptions. One misconception is that social media causes polarization. And what we said was, no, you have to think of it slightly different. Countries vary in their vulnerability to disinformation and hate speech. And it's precisely where you have pre-existing high levels of polarization, where you have distrust within society, distrust of each other, distrust of institutions, and then finally, where you have a history of partisan media, you're going to be extremely vulnerable to disinformation and hate speech through social media. Social media can exacerbate polarization, it can intensify it, amplify it, and all of those things, but it needs some kind of ingredients to work with. Now, the problem for the United States was, if you look at these three indicators, we've been polarized since the 1970s. Trust amongst the American people has been on a steady decline. Trust in our institutions has been on a steady decline. We've had the rise of hyper-partisan media, things like Fox News, right? And so it's a perfect storm that we would be vulnerable to social media, both in terms of inciting hate, but also just, a tsunami of disinformation. And what we said was, in a democracy, there's this line that's thrown out too often that says, if people in a democracy can't agree on the facts, you can't have democracy. And that's actually not true. The reason that you need democracy is that people don't agree on the facts. That's the advantage of democracy, is you have more information, more debate, more interaction than you do in authoritarian countries. But what we said was there is one particular Achilles heel for democracies, and that is disinformation and hate speech that's centered during elections and question the integrity and legitimacy of the elections. That's your Achilles heel in democracies. And so I feel like we've seen all of this over the last year. And on those points, I think the year has supported what our thrust was of the report.
Yeah. Let me draw you out on traditional media and the intersect you see between traditional media, if we can still call it that, and social media. In one sense, we could say that traditional media is damned if they do or damned if they don't. They're either being so keen to be impartial, they're tripping into both sidesism, vanilla coverage, or as you say, going hyper-partisan. How do you situate those responsibilities, not only in the US, but perhaps starting with the US, given that it's the flavor of the month right now?
Great question. So our work was very much influenced by some researchers at Harvard and MIT, one of whom is Yochai Benkler. And they probably have done the most outstanding work on this. And what their work shows is that in terms of disinformation in the United States, there are three sources in particular. We focus always on social media, but in their work, actually the biggest spreader of disinformation over the last 4 years was Donald Trump and his acolytes. The second was Fox News. And then you get to Breitbart, InfoWars, right? All the folks, the really crazy stuff that goes on the internet. And his work showed that there were two different informational ecosystems in the United States. One that was centered on Fox News, and again, a triangular relationship. People who were getting news from Fox News, were also getting news from Trump, were also getting news from Breitbart, InfoWars, et cetera. And the way that they sort of suggested that you should think about this, that there were two Americas, and it wasn't left and right, and it wasn't Democrat, Republican, it was those people who got their news from everything but Fox News, from MSNBC all the way to the Wall Street Journal, and were tethered to reality. This is the key, tethered to reality. And then there was everybody else. And so in the Fox News infosystem, it's almost hopeless. But within the tethered to reality informational ecosystem, there's still a problem. That when you get into, when politics becomes so centered on disinformation, then traditional media has to change how it does its business. It can't do both sidesism. It actually has to stand up for what science says, or what data says, or what evidence says. Now, people who deal with climate change have been railing about this for 30, 35 years. I remember Steve Schneider, the famous climate scientist at Stanford who died way too early, way too young, used to say, this is crazy. You have 100 scientists who say, global warming is real and it's man-made, and you have a front page article in the New York Times, and you're going to treat a spokesman for the 100 and some, crackpot scientist who denies it as the same, right? And so that model just doesn't work when truth is up for grabs, right? And that's where we are right now. Truth is up for grabs. I'll give you other examples. Is on TV news in the United States, the recycling of people who tell lies, it's just stunning. the Trump administration produced all of these acolytes who were part of the crazy informational ecosystem, absolutely lied. Kellyanne Conway was one of them. Actually, she was as responsible as anybody for, you have your facts, we have our facts kind of thing. And yet what happens? They appear on the Sunday news shows. They're go-to people for, not just for Fox News, but for others. And you just, you have to, feel sorry for the American public as they're trying to make sense out of what is truth and what is not truth, where, over there, it's crazy. But in the traditional media, they are both siding it so much. Who knows? Maybe Hillary really did run a pedophile ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. Yep. Fox ran it twice.
So it's a year from your report. Before we dive more into the tech side of things, what has changed in that last year? And more specifically, where did you not go far enough? And who were you too kind on? We have a saying in Salzburg, be tough on the issues and kind on each other. But I want to know where you think now, especially with the wonderful benefit of hindsight, that your commission the report could have been tougher.
Yeah, great questions. So let me start with what we now know, and there can be no doubt about, which is the unmoderated and unregulated use of social media and the internet is a threat to democracy. That is really evident, not just from what we've seen, but the platforms themselves and all the actions that they took in the last month. They were hitting the panic button because they realized, the battle for democracy is on sort of, the knife's edge. And we have to stop all this stuff that is feeding the disinformation and hate and the lies about the integrity of the election and the peaceful turnover of power. They realized it and they acted. And for a lot of us, we wish that would have happened earlier, right? But there can be no doubt now that social media can be weaponized as a threat, as an existential threat against democracy.
But let me jump in there. Was that consumer pressure? Was it the road to Damascus in the corporate boardroom? What was it? Because most of us would perhaps say, or at least people on this call might say, well, about time too. So where do you see the real pressure points having come from, even in recent weeks?
Yeah. So these are great questions, and I actually think there's going to be a great book about this that's going to be written someday. So first of all, you start with their employees, right? The unhappiness of employees at Facebook, for instance, and Google, YouTube, and Twitter about how their platforms were being used. And there was pressure that was building up from inside. You then had, and I think, you turn back to the consumer boycott of Facebook on hate speech grounds, and the platforms not doing enough to deal with racism in the United States, I think was an important moment. And then, now I'm just going to get sort of mercenary here. The platforms also realized that when Joe Biden actually won the election, right, it's going to be a new crew in power, and they're not going to get the free ride that they got under the Trump administration. And so that was another sort of pressure to be responsible. And I suspect there was some real panic as well that was involved in the decision.
Well, they certainly move fast.
They certainly move fast, and it's been very interesting to watch the reaction to them and how they dealt with this.
Can I come in on that, Steve? Because, one of the really interesting things is the Kofi Annan Foundation had hybrid funding from big tech and from several governments, including Austria. We'll hear about that shortly. And as I understand it, his view was that if industry, the tech industry, is perhaps part of the problem, it's got to be part of the solution. What we've seen recently in the US with the deplatforming of former President Trump has put Twitter and Facebook center stage. It's also itself, that act, has polarized opinions, or for some, put the cat among the pigeons. There are some political leaders, Angela Merkel is one example, who is profoundly unhappy that the private sector, that some see as completely unaccountable, has taken the initiative. What are the checks and balances there? And for others, they say this is just yet another proof that regulators have no teeth and are just sitting back and don't understand a thing about what regulation of technology could or should look like. So again, I'd love to draw you out a little bit on that, because this is something that is of huge global relevance and of course triggers different issues for different regulatory regimes, which in turn play into different cultural approaches to public participation, privacy, and security intersects.
Right. No, these are all great questions. And you're right. All of these issues, right, are exploding. But let's step back. In our report, we have a very strong preference. It should be governments that determine what content is moderated. It should be governments that determine, public authorities should determine what is a political advertisement and what should be allowed. There's a whole bunch of stuff that governments should be doing. In the United States, however, there are two problems with, I think, Merkel's sort of interpretation. One is, of course, there is such a heavy government bias in terms of freedom of speech and First Amendment rights that a government has a very difficult time telling both individuals and corporations what it can and cannot say, right? It can do it, but it's extraordinarily difficult. The second thing is that in the absence of a government having regulated, right, and gotten into the regulation game, it is extremely difficult to do it when you are as polarized as the United States is. Because what happens? Regulators, politicians in Washington, over the last 2 to 3 years, are not looking at how do we regulate content on the internet so that it's good for the American people and democracy and free speech. They are looking at it through a partisan lens. How do some decisions we could make about what the platforms do benefit us, right? And so under Trump, you had all of these complaints from conservative lawmakers. Oh, they're constantly deplatforming conservative voices. They're marginalizing conservatives. All false, all false. But they were playing a game, which was, we want to be able to spread lies, spread hate, and anything should go, right? And now the Democrats come in, and they may act in the public interest, but they also might be thinking in terms of, in 2022, what kind of internet and social media would best benefit us in the off-season elections? And if it's heavily regulated, then we go for that. Not that that's the best thing to do for the public. So, what I've learned coming out of this is that if you take regulation of social media seriously, and you're a government, you want to do this at a time when you are not polarized on the knife's edge, where both parties are looking at this as, how does it benefit us? Because if you do, then the public interest is going to be downgraded, and it's all going to be about partisan benefit. And so in the United States, the idea that you are going to get public regulation is extremely difficult. It can happen, but it's extremely difficult. And the choices that, so then it devolves to the platforms to decide what they're going to moderate in terms of content. And everybody has to do this. This is no surprise. Even without government regulations, the platforms have to have some kind of set of rules about what's allowed and what's not allowed. The problem that we pointed out in the report is that the platforms let politicians off the hook. Twitter, Facebook for years, YouTube, community standards, right? Oh, except they don't apply to politicians. If they are public figures, they decided you as citizens of democracies should be able to hear unadulterated anything that a politician says, no matter how crazy it is, no matter how hateful it is. And for me, that's crazy. I don't understand how you build up norms of good behavior on the internet and say, here's the community norms, but our elected officials are not going to be subject to them. That's nuts. That's just crazy. And if we could have gone further in the report, that's where I think I would have come down on, which is, platforms, you cannot exempt, right, elected officials from using social media responsibly.
Well, that's a great note to ask you a quick last question and to segue into our respondent, Antonella, who's now on screen as well. Hi, Antonella, delighted to have you join us. And that is to go back to what you said earlier about the issue of truth being up for grabs, but conversely, the new appetite for truth and for the rebuilding of trust. And there is obviously, as COVID reminds us, a challenge for democratic governments to figure out how to retain or restore trust, particularly at a moment of fear-mongering and public anxiety linked to the pandemic. You've mentioned about the importance of rooting truth and trust in performance, in delivery by governments. So I'd be interested to have a couple of quick reflections about how you see these issues at this time of pandemic. And then I'm going to pass over to Antonella, who's been really on the front line of a lot of the ways in which a government deals with this issue with its citizenry.
Yes. So it's a well-known trend by political scientists about large declines in trust across democracies since about the 1970s, whether it be trust in each other or trust in institutions. Some democracies vary on this. Again, it's not a wave that's encompassed everybody. Democracies do differ on this. And there's been some ups and downs. And this has led to two different interpretations. The first interpretation had to do with, well, it's generational. These are new generations, younger people who are coming up distrustful of government and of society. And maybe there's some technology in there that plays a role. But there's a researcher, Pippa Norris, who looked at the data and said, no, actually, there's a reason to be optimistic here, which actually it shows that public trust still goes up and down, which means it has to be responding to something. And my hypothesis is that it responds to governments that are actually doing well, that are being effective, that are being accountable and being transparent. And that there's reason to hope that if governments can actually improve their performance and how they relate to their citizenry, you can turn this around. Trust can go up. And that's why, what am I optimistic about? I'm actually optimistic about, I'm bullish on truth. I think truth is going to make a comeback. And I think we've gone for 4 years missing truth. And we're going to have a newfound appreciation for it. And it's going to be related to trust because there's no way that we get out of this pandemic unless truth and science and facts prevail. And the governments that allow that to happen are going to build up reservoirs of trust amongst their people. And where it doesn't happen, those polities are going to be in deep, deep trouble for a long time. So I guess I'm a Darwinist when it comes to truth. I mean, those societies that believe in truth are going to do better than those that don't. That's
well, that's a perfect moment to remind us of not just the duty of hope, but of being a profoundly optimistic institution that builds for the long term. Antonella, it's a great moment to bring you in. Welcome to the conversation. And I'm so happy particularly that with your combined business in business and now strategic advice at the political level, you can also bring in a European perspective on these cultural challenges around technology and democracy. So a few brief comments from your side, and then we'll open it to the floor for questions.
Thank you very much, Claire, and what a wonderful opportunity to interact with you. Looking at you, I would, of course, be much. It would be much nicer to be with you in Salzburg. But
we'd love to have you all.
We hope that that is going to take place soon. And thank you very, very much, Stephen, for your thoughts. And by the way, thank you very much for working on this super important topic, and we are very happy that we could support the Kofi Annan Commission on Election and Democracy in a Digital Age with a little bit of money, and particularly, of course, a lot of interest in the results. And so we still hope that we will have the chance to have a discussion of the results also in person when we will travel again. So thank you very much. I think, you know, when I reflect about some of the points that you made, I would like to come back to the title of our discussion, can democracy catch up with technology, and turn it around and really ask the question, can technology catch up with democracy? And when I speak about can technology catch up with democracy, it is about how do the platforms and the people controlling the platforms need to evolve to be participants that increase the trust in the system rather than eroding the trust in the system. And therefore, I think that there are a couple of things that we need to observe. First of all, and I think you mentioned it, I think that we need to have a working, I would say, power balance. I mean, in these days, we all speak about triaging. In this case, you know, it's a power balance between platforms, political institutions, and the public. I think that in this context, I think that these three forces need to work side by side and need to define what is the room of the allowed, what is the room of the possible, and each participant needs to take responsibility. And I think, you know, at the moment we have a void of responsibility, and I think you mentioned it, and I totally agree with you. If the platforms let the politicians off the hook, then they show that they are not catching up with democracy. You know, they show that they are not up to this responsibility. But if they just do as has just happened, you know, that as soon as the administration changes, they then decide to do a big sort of cleanup of Twitter accounts and so on of those who have a different opinion. I think, you know, even though we might think that it's anyhow good to eliminate all the hate speech and all the lies that have been circulating, we need to be very, very careful to do it exactly at this moment. It would have been good to do it before and not now, because I think that the rules should be in place both for the Biden administration as well as for the Trump administration. The rules should be general. And therefore, I would like to come to the point about what can the role of government be in this. What I think is a potential risk is if we have super powerful platforms who then are supported by political intervention by law that may be serving them or may be sort of complacent to them, then we have the perfect disaster. So what we need is to have overarching rules, and these overarching rules need to follow a couple of points. I mean, they need particularly to make sure that they foster transparency, they foster citizen value, citizen orientation, that they eliminate hate speech. And I think, you know, I'll come to that in a second about what we're doing in this context. They need to eliminate hate speech, and they need to make sure that there is a very clear accountability of the platforms, with not with just paying, you know, 1 million or 2 million of fines, which is nothing, you know, for the platform, with really strong fines and really just draconian measures if they do not follow these rules. And I think that is something that cannot be done by one country alone. It needs to happen on a multilateral level. So be it the EU or be it the OECD or be it other multilateral organizations, I think that we need to play up the game. So that just that is the direction in which we are thinking.
Classic thing. I was muted out of respect. Steve, I'm going to jump into some questions from the floor, and then if you want to pick up on Antonella's points as well as we go, we can do that. So we have a very global group of people joining today's conversation, and our first question is from Alfred Mifsud from Malta, who's the chair of the risk committee of the Bank of Valletta. Alfred, can we bring you on, please?
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. Certainly, Salzburg brings back a lot of happy memories. My question is whether a dangerous precedent has been set by having the social media platform act as censors in a democratic process. I'm not suggesting that they were wrong given all the circumstances happening at the time. But frankly, going forward, it could be a dangerous precedent, which ideally should be solved by having regulators, which is not the government itself, because the government is a party and they have a stake in the process as well, but really by some independent super partes body, like exists in many countries, many democratic countries, insofar as the traditional media.
Great.
So I'm worried about getting forward, whether this dangerous precedent could be abused by other people in the future years to come.
Thank you. Steve.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think your remarks are very similar to Antonella's. And I'm very sympathetic to, which is, you know, it should be public authority that should be deciding on, you know, what content is allowed or not allowed. But as I tried to explain why it's been so difficult, at least in the United States, people talk about this as a precedent, but it's not a precedent, actually. The platforms have acted to stop the speech of political leaders around the world when they've been inciting violence. They learned a lesson. It was a very hard lesson, and they haven't learned it fully. But if you go back to, you know, Facebook's experience with Myanmar and the genocide there, you know, they know that their platforms can be weaponized, and they have taken action again, sort of unilaterally and on their own, have taken action. And I think, you know, that's how you should think about what they did this past month. Was they made a decision that democracy was under threat, that both the president and his acolytes and many of the conspiratorialists of QAnon were threatening to overthrow the government, and they made a decision which I think was completely justified. But you are right. it should not be the platforms that have this power. And I also agree with Antonella that ideally you would do this in a multilateral way, that there would be a lot of strength in communities of democracies setting their standards and being carried out by public authorities in distinction to the government, as you mentioned. So I don't think there's disagreement on that. I just think it's extraordinarily difficult to get to, but I agree with you. I think another thing that is going to happen, or is going to be likely to happen, it seems to me, is that, and we didn't deal with this in the report, the question of should you break up some of these platforms? And the reason I raise that is that one of Facebook's defenses in the last 2 months, when people were saying, you have standards and you are not applying it equally across the board, right? You say you're taking down hate speech, but here's 20 more new groups or new pages, et cetera. And one of their defenses was, but we're so big. We process, 9 gazillion pieces of information a day. How do you expect us to get everything? Well, that to me is one of the, I don't know, it's like where they get their public relations, but I mean, they're just giving away the game. Well, okay, Facebook, if you are so big that you can't do this, that you are incapable of policing your own community standards, then maybe you shouldn't be this big. And so I think that's going to be one of the next battles, quite frankly.
Yeah, very, very interesting, both at the domestic and the multilateral level, these challenges that we're hearing coming out, particularly at a time where more broadly, the whole multilateral architecture is under question in terms of a nation's commitments to be more ambitious at the cross-border level. Thank you, Alfred. And we're going to pass now to Roland Huang, who's a lecturer in the Department of American Culture. I'm sorry, Roland, I don't know where your department is, but I'm sure you can tell us. And if we keep the question short and then expand out. Do we have Roland? We do.
Yes.
Thank you, Roland.
I'm right here.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Yep. Oh, thank you. Yeah, Roland Huang from Michigan. I'm just concerned about the manner in which regulation might occur, given so many platforms to deal with, and dealing with words of violence or innuendo or incitement and coded speech. I'm just wondering how, such a regimen might operate. And does anyone have any ideas on how to do it?
Great punchy question. Steve, and then if you want to jump in, Antonella, but particularly Steve on this one, I think.
Yeah, so it actually relates to one of the points that we made in the report, which is that if Facebook in particular is going to be, have a global market all around the world, and they realize that their platform can be used to incite horrific violence, then they are going to have to invest in local capacity to be able to understand linguistically sort of what is hateful speech, what is a threat, and so forth. It's very culture bound. And one of the things that Facebook, is Twitter, excuse me. One of the complaints about Twitter from a couple of weeks ago was when they took down Trump's Twitter feed and said this is permanent. They cited that his remarks of that day, which for Trump weren't that malignant. I mean, he's said worse things, but they said we have, basically we've interpreted this as coded urging of his supporters to violence, and they took a lot of pressure on that, a lot of attacks, but it's exactly what they have to do all around the world. Threats of violence when they occur in societies aren't just go out and kill somebody. It can be something like, it is time to chop down the tall trees, right? Which was something from Rwanda, right? You have to know that. right? And you can't be literal. You can't just simply say, oh, they're talking about the forest. No, they're talking about incitement to violence and genocide, right? It is extremely difficult. And it's probably, I think you're going to have to get out of the realm of, the sort of AI kind of stuff where you really have to invest in human talent to be able to understand this stuff and make judgments.
And that ties into a question I saw raised in the chat box, which was about the transparency of algorithms. And we all are familiar, I think, or becoming increasingly familiar with the issue of the diversity of those who do the coding, who set the algorithms. And, I will make an unashamed claim again for the importance of the humanities in this space, because the kind of cultural interpretation and linguistic interpretation that Steve just mentioned is going to require a multiplicity of skills in this space to be effective. I want to bring
may I add one point, Claire,
Indeed.
about, I think, the question before, I think, is such an important question about how do you define what needs to be taken down, and I think that we had a very important example now in the COVID crisis. I mean, we had in the Chancellery, we have a team that has been looking at disinformation and trying, as we say, just to flatten the disinformation curve, side by side by flattening the curve, the virus curve. And I think that you need to always look at the context in which disinformation is happening. So we had 4 categories, and I think that is where you need the help of AI and of intelligent interpretation, and just the civil society participating. And we looked at, as I said, 4 categories. Conspiracy theories had to be controlled. Trivialization of the virus, because a lot of people were doing trivialization, and you need to, to make sure that it's not trivialized by putting in the right information. Very dangerous recommendations like, just whatever, self-diagnosis or other stupid elements, and false claims about coming measures that the government is supposed to doing. So, I mean, there were these 4 categories that we were looking to, and on each of this category, the only sort of counter element that you have is really to make sure that you bring in the right evidence to debunk this. But on some platforms, if we look at which platforms are being used to distribute this information, you have not the chance to take down the information. WhatsApp is one of the platforms that is used very much to distribute information, and there you cannot ask them to take it down. So it's much more difficult to control it, while on Twitter or on Facebook, you have the possibility to control it. So I think that we need to look holistically, case by case, what do we need to do in terms of what are the permissions to act that we have, and what are the possibilities in order to clean up, from active disinformation.
That's really fascinating to hear that taxonomy of what the Austrian government and its advisors were looking for. And I giggled when you said dangerous recommendations, because I thought about bleach, swallowing thereof. Yeah. Roland, thank you. Roland, thank you so much. Now we're going to have Julia Matamoros, who's the Partnerships Officer at the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. Julia, do we have you ready to leap onto our screens? If not, we can move on to another question. Okay. Can we bring David Gleeson on? Or if that's not immediately, David isn't immediately there, I'll ask a question myself. So David, excuse me, but I'll jump in. I understand that David's question related to the whole issue of financial incentives for the technology companies. And I know several other people, even before this event, have raised the broader question about finance and the culture of finance, both in democracy and technology, which obviously varies between countries. So if I can lead you, Steve, into that space of thinking about the finance piece, particularly in a space of a couple of weeks where we've seen several major corporations use their financial muscle to engage very visibly in democratic process. Julie will come back to you because I just asked the finance question. Please stay there and we'll just have some quick inputs on finance, and then we'll come back to you as our last questioner, Julia.
Yeah. This actually goes back to the first Kofi Commission back in 2010 to 2012. And one of the points that we made, that is, if you want to have elections with integrity, you can't have unfettered political finance. You had to regulate it. And the reason that you had to regulate it was for reasons of political equality. And we made the point that, if you look at the difference between Canada and the United States, one of the biggest differences was a Supreme Court decision in Canada that basically said that political equality trumps campaign finance as free speech, whereas in the United States, they decided that campaign finance is free speech and that trumps political equality. And so, it is extraordinarily difficult to regulate political finance in the United States. But one way you can, as a consumer, is that you can take your business elsewhere if you don't like what corporations are doing in terms of who they are donating to, or what political action committees that they're supporting, and so forth. And so I think what you've seen over the last couple of weeks is a twofold reaction. One is that many businesses, again, realize this has been a very dangerous game that's not going to help us in the long run in terms of political stability. But I think they also recognize that there's going to be a price to pay if they keep supporting politicians who just deal in disinformation and lies.
Can I just back up my question, because I've now got David's specifics in front of me, about financial incentives, saying the platform's primary customers are, of course, the advertisers, and what will make them want to change. I think you've touched on it, but the whole issue of the business models, both for social media platforms and traditional media, needs to be open to scrutiny, because, as we all know, there's an absolute crisis and that tension of honest reporting and paying for the socks and the bacon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think when we did the commission, we did not deal with the larger question about, for instance, should the big platforms be broken up, right? And I think that was a wise decision at the time, because we really wanted to focus on this question of elections, in particular, integrity of elections and democracy. But these are the kinds of questions that are coming, for sure, and they've already started, having to do with some of the corporate practices and anti-competition policies of some of the platforms. I think people are exactly concerned, as they've been for a long time, about an economic model that rewards sensationalism, craziness, right? But I will say this, because again, we've been very selective in our complaints about business models. Everybody loves to complain about the platforms just want clicks. And so they put all this sensational stuff out there because they profit from it. True, right? And what do you think the tabloids do? They do the same thing. What do you think Fox News does? Fox News runs these crazies because Fox News has a big market share, right? And what about the politicians, members of parliament or politicians who do this? It's like, it's not profit, but it's vote share.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these, there is a business model that's inherent in all of these different dimensions. And are we right to be outraged about the platforms? Absolutely, right? And there's some good ideas that are finally starting to come up about how do you transform something like from what we have to much safer and better and more interactive community public spaces, right, on the internet, right? Think about it positively. How do we transform this into something that can be supportive of democracy and that you can still build a business model around? as opposed to this, clickbait model that obviously has gotten us into a lot of trouble.
Yeah, interesting. Antonella, over to
Yeah,
you.
I think, the question about the financial incentives is an essential one. And I think, it's true that media overall, of course, have an interest in getting high awareness and high reach. And that's for sure one of the, and therefore, I mean, they are in the attention economy, they're part of the attention economy. But I think that the special thing about the platforms is that they thrive on richness of data, on the richness of data and the reach that they achieve. And therefore they profit over proportionally from the clickbait model without sharing the same level of responsibility as media. And I think, one of the key points is that at the moment they are in a regulatory limbo, I would say, because they do not, they do not have the same responsibilities, but they can thrive on the same advantages. So richness of data, clearly they have an interest in getting more and more behavioral data, and that's why the political data are so enormously relevant to them, because they can monetize them with an overproportional premium to the advertisers. And they have no discount really on the context where they put it in. They normally, the context is a very important element for traditional media. Where is your advertising being viewed? But on social media, because you cannot really fix the context is individual, they do not have a discount for the wrong context. Only after the fact, if you can prove that, for example, your advertising was next to a beheading of somebody, then you can start to discuss how that that you do not advertise anymore with a platform, but you do not get a discount for that, because actually you get a premium for that because you have probably a higher traffic going there. And I think that is inherently the problem with the business model of digital platforms.
This is fascinating, and it reminds me in the field of sustainable development and environment, where people talk about negative externalities, how long it is taking for both financial and political policy instruments to catch up with that kind of level playing field. And it could be very interesting to look at some crosswalks for future design of regulation. Now we can bring Julia back. She's been patiently waiting. She went invisible for a second. Julia, as I mentioned, is from the Canadian Citizenship Council. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. My question is regarding digital rights activism. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more on the role it has played in bringing awareness on privacy and regulation to the mainstream, and how it might be different from the other factors you listed earlier, because it's been long brewing. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's certainly been an enormous amount of digital rights advocacy. It's been incredibly effective, I think, in Europe. It's been much more effective in Europe than in the United States, although very different context because of the First Amendment. I wish that there was as much digital activism that was centered on questions of truth and fact checking and hate speech, and as there is on digital rights. It's not that there should be less on digital rights. I would just like the other sort of aspects of the internet in terms of social activism to catch up with the digital rights community. And then, some of the things that we asked for in our report, there are some tensions. For instance, one of the things that we asked for in our report is that the platforms, public authorities should make platforms share their data, so that researchers, now you would have to do all kinds of vetting and all kinds of standards to be able to protect the data. But nonetheless, this is really important because for so many of the claims that are made about the algorithms and whether the algorithms are rabbit holes for extremism, all this other stuff, you know, until the platforms actually share their data and are much more open with their data, we're never going to adjudicate these questions. Facebook agreed to do this a couple of years ago, and then you know, progress has been so slow, in part because they keep hiding behind, you know, points raised by the digital rights folks. So this is somewhere where you know, some accommodation is going to have to be reached, and you're going to have to figure out what are the protections that are needed for individual data to be able to share this. But until that happens, some of the claims that are made about the platforms and polarization and mobilization and extremism, we're just not going to be able to adjudicate.
Antonella, do you want to come in on that? You're muted. Yeah,
I think there is very little to add. I do totally agree with Stephen points.
Great. I'd like to just
the next time that we have a commission, Antonella, you have to be one of my commissioners.
Yeah.
Well, I think this audience is writing some of the critical issues for the next commission as well. I'm looking at some of the very rich conversation in the chat box and trying to pull out a couple of themes so that we can dive in just for another sort of 3-4 minutes. And the issues of the smaller countries and the sort of different value systems are coming up in the conversation as well. And I think some fear, and I'm probably not synthesizing this very well, but how, in a sense, is it not a sort of top-heavy thing designed and delivered from the US, which the rest of the world has to sort of squeeze to fit its own local circumstances, given where the sort of main tech growth has been from? So that's.
May I take this up, because I think
absolutely.
It's such an important point, and that's what it comes back to the point that I tried to make before, that you need this triaging in the triangle between platforms, political institutions, and public. And you need to do it on a multilateral level. And multilateralism in its best sense, you know, with no dominant players. I think you need to take everybody with you. And that's why I'm thinking that probably one of the institutions that could support this, or one of the multilateral institutions that could support this, is the OECD, which is, you know, representing many different participants, or even, I mean, potentially, you know, we even can think about other groupings. But it's super important that it's not going to be determined by those countries where the platforms are headquartered, where the financial interest is clearly divergent from the small countries where these platforms are not headquarters, and where, by the way, any legal solution is limited by the fact that because the platforms don't have any headquarter or any representation, it's very difficult to harm them with financial fines, for example. So I think that there is a real issue about how to make sure that smaller countries have their voice and have also the possibility to really have their rights being observed, and followed.
I just want to, can I piggyback on this?
Please do.
Antonella is absolutely right that, to my mind, multilateralism is going to be a huge benefit for both smaller countries with small markets, right? That's really the crux of this question is, you know, if you are a small country in the global South, you don't have a big market share, and you have problems with Facebook. Facebook doesn't care. Why would they care, right? You have no market share, right? Doesn't matter. Well, one way they might care is that if you are aligned with, you know, 30 or 40 countries that take a principled stand about the behavior of the platforms that have market share, then it makes a difference. But I would also add, looking elsewhere and looking for a multilateral approach also helps citizens who are in countries where their own governments might be the ones that are wreaking havoc on the platforms or inciting violence or sharing disinformation, right? You know, one of the complaints about Facebook is that it's been very hands-off in terms of India. It's been more hands-off in terms of India than what they've done in the United States. And there have been a lot of allegations about really nasty uses of social media by some politicians in India. And the Facebook seems reluctant to act. Well, you know, from a business model perspective, that's understandable. India is a huge market and they don't want to irritate the government of the day. Fair enough. But the people of India should want platforms that are safe, that they can go to without fear of seeing incitement or having people incited to violence because of the internet. They should have an internet that they can count on in terms of trying to figure out information and disinformation. And one way you can get that is that, you know, multilateral coalitions can stand up for what the standards are, right?
Excellent. Well, that's a practical note on which to pivot to bringing in Edward Mortimer for some comments. Edward is my predecessor here at Salzburg Global Seminar as the Vice President for Programs, but more importantly in this context, he was very close to Kofi Annan as his speechwriter and Director of Communications for many years pre-Salzburg. So both Stephen and Edward shared a great friendship with Kofi Annan, but also are passionate champions of multilateralism. So Edward's going to share a few reflections there, and then we'll give Stephen a chance to come back just literally quite concisely. Edward, lovely to see you.
Good. Can you also hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And for those nice remarks, Claire. I should say that I'm actually, insofar as I have any role in this meeting, it is certainly as your successor, and I've put on my Salzburg seminar tie, especially for the occasion, but also as the current chair of the 21st Century Trust, which is the sort of sister organization of the Salzburg Global Seminar in Britain. I think I can claim honestly that it was our idea to invite Steve, and I think we're very, very grateful to Salzburg for giving him this larger platform and for the excellent interactive format that you've used, and certainly bringing in Antonella was a brilliant idea. The 21st Century Trust goes back to the early 1990s, and this question of democracy, how it develops, has been a concern of ours for a very long time. In fact, I think one of the earliest meetings was in 1991, bringing together fellows from all around the world, including China, on the question of liberal democracy and free market capitalism, global panacea or Western interest. And more recently, we've been convening groups to explore the themes remaking the state, the impact of the digital revolution now and to come, that was in 2016, and doubling down on democracy, how to deal with existential threats to rule of, by and for the people in 2018. And we also sponsored the recent wonderful Palliser lecture by Margaret Macmillan on the question of should history carry a health warning. And we definitely intend to continue. And I think that's just as well, because listening to this discussion, my main reaction is, that it's an impossible discussion to wrap up, because new ideas and particularly new questions keep popping up, and there's no way we're going to reach a conclusion anytime soon. But of course, it's a far too important discussion for us to neglect. I was asked to give some concluding reflections, but they, I'm afraid, necessarily rather incoherent in the circumstances. I think it's important perhaps to go back to a couple of points that Steve made earlier on. When one is the reference to the earlier problems, particularly in Africa, but by no means unique to Africa, that the previous Kofi Annan Commission was dealing with. And Claire talked about the dramatic events in Washington having sucked out some of the oxygen from the international discussion. That certainly makes me think of what's been happening in Uganda. I almost wonder whether Museveni didn't arrange to have the election around the time that a new president would be taking over in the United States, in the hope that what he was getting up to would attract less attention. But those problems that Steve alluded to about people refusing to leave power and finding various subterfuges to avoid doing so are very far from unique to the United States. And I think, touching wood, one could say that the United States has coped rather well with this first instance, at least in living memory, of a president trying to do that. Whereas in other parts of the world, these continue to be very current and have not gone away at all. Another point, I think, a very important point, I think, that Steve made was in worrying about the effect of new media, we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that everything was fine before and that the traditional media are perfect. I mean, I think he made an important point that actually social media are by no means solely and perhaps not even primarily responsible for the problems that democracy, and perhaps even above and before democracy, the ascertaining and telling of the truth face, that it is more traditional media like Fox News who pick up some of the more poisonous and patently false things that are circulating on social media and give them a far greater exposure and resonance, and that if it was left entirely in the domain of social media, it might not have the same effect. But certainly the traditional media were never perfect and never reliably objective or accurate, and certainly never disinterested. There have always been very powerful economic interests which have determined to a greater or lesser degree what facts and what opinions get exposed to the general public. So this is an age-old problem presenting itself to some extent in a new form, but one that we have to continue to struggle with.
Absolutely. Edward, thank you so much.
That's too much. That's long enough, sorry.
No, not at all, not at all, but thank you so much. And Steve, if you wanted any, like 1 minute of quick thoughts, otherwise I'll wrap up with some thanks.
My quick thoughts are thanks to the 21st Century Trust, to the Salzburg Seminar, to the government of Austria, to Antonella and Edward for joining us, and to you, Claire, for moderating and just being a great conversation partner. Yeah, I think you're right, Edward. This is not something that can be wrapped up. This is something we're going to be living with. I mean, when you were mentioning, what Trump was trying to do was very reminiscent. I mean, in my mind, was Gbagbo in Cote d'Ivoire, right? This was, this was Donald Trump. It's like, no, we won the election. It's like everybody else is wrong. We won the election. We won the election. They stole the election. And of course, in the case of Gbagbo, it was, the UN and the French coming in and peacekeepers coming in and saying, actually, you lost the election. So the United States was able to do that without the arrival of UN peacekeepers. That's a good thing. But, we're going to live with this for a long time. This could become a perpetual feature of American democracy unless we solve some basic problems about electoral integrity. There are constant, we might live in a landscape where it's just constantly every 2 to 4 years, somebody stole the election. And the delegitimizing of elections is, again, it's the Achilles heel of democracy.
Well,
so you're right. This is not going to end. I don't want to end, and I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. As I said, I am a believer that truth is going to have a comeback. Maybe it's Darwinian, but those societies that actually recognize truth, facts, science are actually going to do better than those that do not. And that's why I'm bullish on truth.
Well, Steve did the wonderful job of doing thanks, and I'm just going to reiterate thanks to Stephen, to Antonella, to Edward, and to all of you. Just a couple of closing remarks. I was personally in tears yesterday in front of my television watching the young poet Amanda Gorman. And there are so many lines I wanted to share again today, but you know, she said, while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. And she also said, a nation that isn't broken, but is unfinished. And I think that's the reminder that democracy is a work in progress. Please stay engaged, because our programs are a work in progress. And as Edward said, we pick up on big themes and continue them. And on the 25th of February, join us again. We have a great program coming up on Who Owns the Past, which is going to dive deep into the whole issue of contested histories, decolonization, and the shifting balance of people and power. So it couldn't be more aligned with what we've talked about today and what Salzburg Global will certainly focus on in the years and decades to come. Thank you again, Stephen, Antonella, Edward, thank you so much. And please, everybody, stay healthy.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.